He was 18 for exactly 7 hours when his stepmother kicked him out, and what he found wasn't just an old building, but the story of a life he never knew and a choice that would define his own. If you've ever felt like your world was ending, only to find it was just beginning, I think you'll understand this. Stick with me, and maybe subscribe if you feel a connection here, because these are the kinds of stories we need more of. The air in the house had been thin for years, stretched taut over the silence my father left behind. On my 18th birthday, it finally snapped. Brenda, my stepmother, was waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs when I came down for breakfast. There was no cake, no card. Just a manila envelope on the polished surface of the dining table, sitting there like a verdict. Her face was a careful mask of strained neutrality, the kind people wear when they're about to do something necessary and unkind. "Leo," she said, her voice crisp, devoid of any warmth. "We need to talk." I knew this talk. I'd been bracing for it since the day Dad died, 2 years, 4 months, and 11 days ago. I had been a legal obligation, a line item in a will, a countdown clock ticking toward this exact morning. "Happy birthday," she added, an afterthought that felt sharper than an insult. I didn't say anything. I just looked at the envelope. My name was typed on it, formal and sterile. Leo Vance. Inside, I knew, was my freedom, which felt an awful lot like an eviction notice. "Your father made certain arrangements," she began, launching into a rehearsed speech. She spoke about trusts, legal majority, and fiduciary responsibilities. The words were big and hollow, rattling around in the quiet room. She was releasing me into the wild, and she was doing it with paperwork to prove she'd done her duty. She handed me a check for $5,000. "This is the remainder of the educational fund. Since you've shown no inclination toward college, it's legally yours to manage now." I took it. The paper felt cold. It was severance pay for a childhood. "And there's this," she said, pushing the manila envelope toward me. "Your father's only other real property. It's in your name now. The deed, the keys, everything is in there. Frankly, it's more of a liability than an asset, but it's yours." I opened the clasp. Inside was a thick sheaf of documents held together with a rusty paperclip. A deed, property tax records from a town I'd never heard of, and a small, tarnished brass key on a loop of string. The property was listed as Vance and Son Harness Company, located in Oakhaven, a place that sounded like it was invented for a postcard. "A harness shop?" I asked, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. My dad had been an accountant. He wore suits and carried a briefcase. He smelled of coffee and paper, not leather and horse sweat. Brenda gave a delicate shrug. "It was his father's. Your grandfather. Your dad inherited it and just kept it. Paid the taxes on it every year. I told him to sell it a dozen times. It's been sitting empty for 30 years. It's probably condemned by now. But he was sentimental." She said the word sentimental like it was a diagnosis for a terminal illness. "You have until the end of the day to pack your things. I've been very patient, Leo, but this house needs to move on. I need to move on." And that was it. The door to my life, the only one I'd ever known, was closing. I stood there, holding a check that felt like an apology and a key that felt like a joke. A worthless harness shop. A condemned building in the middle of nowhere. That was my inheritance. That was the sum total of what my father had left for me. A ruin. It felt fitting, in a way. I felt like a ruin myself. I went upstairs without another word, the thin air in the house finally rushing out, leaving a vacuum in its place. I packed a single duffel bag with a few changes of clothes, a worn photo of my dad and me at a baseball game, and the manila envelope. I didn't have much else that felt like it belonged to me. The furniture, the books, the life humming within those walls. It was all hers. I had just been a ghost haunting the hallways, and now, my time was up. The bus ride to Oakhaven was 8 hours of watching the world blur past the greasy window. The city's skyline bled into sprawling suburbs, which then dissolved into flat, empty farmland stitched together by long, straight roads. I watched the sun crawl across the sky, my reflection a pale, translucent ghost superimposed over the rolling hills. Each mile put more distance between me and Brenda, between me and the silent, sterile house that had stopped being a home the moment my father's heart stopped beating. The $5,000 felt like a hot coal in my pocket. It was enough to survive for a few months if I was careful, but it wasn't enough to build a life. It was a buffer, a shallow moat between me and total desperation. The real question mark was Oakhaven. It was a name on a map, a destination on a bus ticket, but it felt more like a myth. What kind of person just holds on to an empty building for 30 years? My dad was pragmatic, a man of ledgers and spreadsheets. As Brenda said, he wasn't sentimental. Or at least, that's how I remembered him in the last few years, after my mom passed and he remarried. He'd grown quiet, distant, encased in a sadness so deep it seemed to absorb all the light around him. The bus wheezed to a stop in what I assumed was Oakhaven's town square. It wasn't much of a square, more of a wide spot in the road with a small, patchy lawn and a granite war memorial listing names from conflicts I'd only read about in history books. The town itself looked tired. The brick buildings lining the main street had a faded, weary look to them, their signs painted in peeling letters advertising hardware, groceries, and a diner called the Corner Booth. There was a quiet dignity to the place, the sense that it had seen better days but wasn't ready to give up just yet. I felt a strange kinship with it. I slung my duffel bag over my shoulder and pulled out the crumpled tax receipt from the envelope. 14 Chestnut Street. I asked the bus driver, a man with a kind, wrinkled face, for directions. He pointed down the street without hesitation. Ah, the old Vance place, end of the block, next to the creek. Been empty as long as I can remember. He looked at me, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. You must be one of them. I didn't know what he meant, so I just nodded and thanked him. The walk was short. Chestnut Street was lined with enormous oak trees that canopied the road, dappling the cracked pavement in shifting patterns of light and shadow. And there it was. Number 14. It was worse than I'd imagined. The building was a 2-story wooden structure with a false front, like something out of an old western. The paint, once a deep barn red, had peeled and weathered to a pale, ghostly pink. The large display windows on the ground floor were so coated in grime they were nearly opaque. Above them, a long wooden sign hung crookedly from one hinge. The words, Vance and Son Harness Company, were still faintly visible, ghosts of a forgotten trade. The and Son was in a different, smaller script, a hopeful addition that now just looked tragic. A thick curtain of ivy crawled up one side of the building, its tendrils prying into the siding, slowly claiming the structure for the earth. It wasn't just empty, it looked heartbroken. I stood on the sidewalk, the weight of the duffel bag digging into my shoulder, and felt a profound sense of despair wash over me. This was it. This was my legacy. A derelict building filled with 30 years of dust and disappointment. Brenda was right. It was a liability, a joke. My first instinct was to turn around, get back on the next bus, and just disappear. Go anywhere else. But where? I had nowhere to go. This ruin was the only thing in the entire world that was mine. Taking a deep breath that tasted of damp soil and decay, I walked up the 3 sagging wooden steps to the front door. The brass key felt small and inadequate in my hand. I slid it into the lock. It was stiff, resistant. For a moment, I thought it wouldn't turn, that the building itself was refusing me entry. I put my shoulder into the door, jiggled the key with more force, and with a groan of metal and a sharp crack, the lock gave way. The door swung inward into a wall of darkness, releasing a sigh of stale, musty air. It smelled of time. It smelled of rot and old wood and something else, something faint and animal and earthy. It smelled of leather. The inside was a cavern of shadows. The thick grime on the windows filtered the late afternoon sun into a weak, hazy twilight. Dust motes danced like constellations in the few beams of light that managed to pierce the gloom. As my eyes adjusted, the shape of the room began to emerge. It was a long, deep space, a workshop frozen in time. A heavy wooden workbench ran the length of one wall, its surface scarred with the cuts and gouges of 1,000 forgotten projects. Tools I couldn't name hung from pegs on the wall, their metal surfaces coated in a soft blanket of rust and cobwebs. Rolls of leather, stiff and cracked with age, were stacked in a corner, leaning against each other like tired old men. Half-finished harnesses and bridles hung from hooks on the ceiling, their straps dangling like skeletal fingers in the dim light. They were monuments to a moment of interruption, a life that had simply stopped mid-task. The air was thick, heavy, and silent. The only sound was the frantic beat of my own heart and the gentle creak of the sign outside, swaying in the breeze. I dropped my duffel bag by the door, the sound startlingly loud in the oppressive quiet. I felt like an intruder, a grave robber. This place wasn't just empty, it was haunted by the ghosts of work, of purpose, of a life that had belonged to my grandfather, a man I'd never met. And my father, why had he kept this place? Why pay taxes on a tomb for 30 years? I ran a hand along the workbench, my fingers coming away black with grime. Beneath the dust, the wood was smooth, worn down by decades of use. This was a place of skill, of craft. It felt real, tangible, in a way my father's life of numbers and spreadsheets never had. I moved deeper into the shop, my boots kicking up clouds of dust. Toward the back, behind a long counter with a silent, hulking cash register, was a small door. I pushed it open and found a tiny office. There was a desk, a chair, and a single metal filing cabinet. Everything was coated in the same thick layer of dust. The desk was surprisingly clear, except for a single, leather-bound ledger lying closed in the center. I sat down in the wooden chair, which groaned in protest under my weight. I felt an overwhelming urge to just close my eyes and sleep, to give in to the exhaustion that was pulling at the edges of my mind. But a flicker of something else, a stubborn little ember of curiosity, kept me awake. Why this place? I opened the ledger. The first few pages were filled with my grandfather's handwriting. A strong, looping cursive detailing sales of saddles, repairs to bridles, orders for custom work. The entries were dated from the 1950s all the way to the late 1980s. Then they stopped. I flipped toward the back of the book, expecting to find nothing but empty, yellowed pages. But there was one more entry. It was dated just 3 years ago, a year before my father died. It was in his familiar, neat block printing. It wasn't an account of a sale. It was a single sentence. For Leo, the answer is in the heartwood. I read it again and again. The words made no sense. For Leo, the answer is in the heartwood. It was a riddle, a clue. My father, the pragmatic accountant, the man who had grown so distant and quiet, had left me a riddle in a forgotten harness shop. For the first time since I'd stepped off the bus, a feeling other than despair began to take root in my chest. It was a fragile, tentative thing, but it felt unmistakably like hope. The phrase, "the heartwood," echoed in my mind. Heartwood is the central, supporting pillar of a tree, the dense, dead core that gives it strength. It wasn't a term I expected my father to know. I looked around the shop, seeing it now not just as a dusty relic, but as a puzzle box. The answer is in the heartwood. Was he talking about the building itself? The wooden beams? The floorboards? I started in the small office, tapping on the walls, knocking on the heavy oak desk. Nothing sounded hollow. I pulled open the drawers of the filing cabinet. They were packed solid with old invoices and supplier catalogs, all from my grandfather's time. I spent an hour sifting through brittle, yellowed paper, the smell of dust and time filling my lungs. Nothing. It felt like a wild goose chase, a cruel joke left by a man I no longer understood. Frustration began to bubble up, hot and bitter. I was tired, hungry, and alone in a collapsing building with a cryptic message as my only guide. I moved back into the main workshop, my eyes scanning every surface. The workbench was massive, built from a single slab of dark, heavy wood that had to be at least 4 inches thick. I ran my hands along its scarred surface, feeling the nicks and grooves left by my grandfather's tools. I knocked on it. It was solid as a rock. I checked the support beams overhead, thick timbers dark with age and soot. I looked at the floorboards, many of them warped and uneven. Nothing stood out. The sun was setting, and the dim light inside the shop was failing, the shadows growing longer and deeper, swallowing what little detail remained. Defeated, I slumped against the workbench, my head in my hands. Maybe Brenda was right. Maybe my dad was just sentimental, and this note was the rambling of a man lost in his own grief. Maybe there was no answer. As I sat there, my fingers idly traced the edge of the workbench. I felt a small, almost imperceptible irregularity in the wood. It was a seam, so fine it was almost invisible, disguised by decades of grime and the natural grain of the wood. My heart began to beat a little faster. I scraped at the seam with my fingernail, dislodging a sliver of dirt. It was a perfect rectangle, about the size of a shoebox lid. A hidden compartment. It had no handle, no knob. I pushed on it, tried to pry it with my fingers, but it wouldn't budge. I looked around the workbench and saw an old, flat-headed chisel lying among the rusted tools. I picked it up, the cold metal a solid weight in my hand. Carefully, I wedged the tip into the hairline crack and gently pried. The wood groaned, then, with a soft pop, the small panel lifted. My hands were shaking as I set the panel aside and reached into the dark cavity. My fingers brushed against something solid and metallic. I pulled it out. It was a small tin box, the kind people used to keep cash or important papers in. It was heavy. It was locked. There was no key. I looked at the box, then back at the chisel in my hand. It took a few tries, but I managed to wedge the tip under the lid and force the simple lock. The lid sprang open with a metallic clang. I held my breath and looked inside. It was filled with letters. Dozens of them, bundled together with faded ribbon. And underneath the letters, wrapped in oilcloth, were stacks of cash. $100 bills. I pulled one stack out, and another, and another. I counted it right there, in the dying light of the workshop, my hands trembling so badly I kept losing my place. It was $50,000. More money than I'd ever seen in my life. It was enough to run away, to start over, to go anywhere. It was a ticket out. But it was the letters that held my attention. They were addressed to me, in my father's handwriting. The top envelope simply said, "Leo, start here." I sat on the dusty floor of the workshop, the tin box in my lap, and I opened the first letter. The paper was crisp, the ink a dark, solid blue. His handwriting was just as I remembered it, precise, controlled, the handwriting of an accountant. But the words were from a man I didn't know at all. "My dearest Leo," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have found your way here. I am sorry. I am sorry for so many things. For the silence of the last few years, for the distance that grew between us. I hope, through these letters, you can begin to understand, and maybe, to forgive." I had to stop and take a breath, a knot tightening in my throat. His voice was so clear in my head, it was as if he were sitting there in the darkness with me. This shop, the letter continued, was my father's. He built it with his own hands. He poured his life into this wood, this leather. When he died, everyone told me to sell it. It was a relic, they said, a business from a bygone era. But I couldn't. Because this place is more than a building, Leo. It's a promise. The letter went on to tell a story I'd never heard. My grandfather, it turned out, hadn't just been a harness maker. During the Vietnam War, he had used the shop as a quiet way station for young men who were conscientious objectors, kids who were terrified and had nowhere to go. He would give them a place to stay for a few nights, a hot meal, and a little money before helping them get to Canada. He never asked for anything in return. It was a secret he kept his entire life. He believed, my father wrote, that some things were more important than laws. Things like conscience, things like kindness. He made me promise, Dad wrote, that if the need ever arose, Vance and Son would always be a place of refuge, a safe harbor. I never thought I would have to keep that promise. I built a different life for myself, a life of numbers and clean, predictable outcomes. And then I met your mother. And then we had you. And my world, which had been black and white, exploded into color. I cried then, silent, hot tears that dripped onto the dusty floorboards. I cried for the years of silence, for the man I thought had emotionally abandoned me after Mom died. He hadn't been abandoning me. He'd been preparing. The letter explained the money. After my mother got sick, the medical bills were astronomical. My father, the meticulous accountant, had started taking on side work, bookkeeping for small businesses, often for cash. He worked late into the night, long after Brenda was asleep. He wasn't just paying off debt, he was building a nest egg, a secret fund. I couldn't put it in a bank, he wrote. Brenda has access to all our joint accounts. She's not a bad person, Leo, but she is a practical one. To her, this shop is a dead asset and you are an expense that has come to term. I knew she would not see you through. This money is for you, to give you a start, to give you a choice. A choice. That's what he had left me. Not a ruin, but a choice. The letter ended with an instruction. There are more letters. They will tell you the rest of the story. But first, you have a decision to make. You can take the money and go. Build a life for yourself far away from here. No one would blame you. Or you can stay. You can see the promise through. The answer to what comes next is in the heartwood. I meant that literally. Look to the main support post in the center of the workshop. Your grandfather was a clever man. I put the letter down, my hands shaking. I felt dizzy, disoriented, like the entire world had tilted on its axis. My father wasn't the man I thought he was. He was braver, more complex, and he had loved me more fiercely than I had ever known. His silence hadn't been apathy, it had been a shield. He had been protecting this legacy, protecting me. I looked at the stacks of cash, then around the dark, dilapidated shop. I could walk away. I could be on a bus to anywhere in an hour. Or I could stay. Listen, if you've made it this far, maybe this story is hitting something deep inside you. We all have family stories, hidden histories we think we understand, but maybe we don't. Have you ever discovered something about a parent or a grandparent that changed everything you thought you knew? Let me know in the comments. Your stories matter just as much as mine, and this community is a place where we can share them. It helps, knowing you're not the only one who has had to redraw the map of their own past. Now let's get back to it. I had a choice to make and a puzzle to solve. I didn't even have to think about it. The idea of leaving felt like a betrayal. It would be like taking the money and leaving my father all over again. I had to stay. I had to know the rest of the story. I stood up and walked to the center of the workshop. There was a single, massive wooden post that ran from the floor to the ceiling, a thick, round pillar of dark, ancient wood. It was the structural heart of the building, the heartwood. I ran my hands over its rough, textured surface. It felt solid, immovable. I searched for a seam, a panel, a hidden latch, but there was nothing. It was just a post. I remembered my father's words. Your grandfather was a clever man. It wasn't going to be obvious. I stepped back and looked at the post from a distance. About halfway up, at eye level, there was a dark knot in the wood, a natural imperfection. It was just one of many, but this one seemed different, darker. I reached out and pressed my thumb against it. It didn't move. I pushed harder. Nothing. Then, almost by accident, my fingers twisted it. It turned. With a soft click, a section of the post, no bigger than my hand, popped open on a tiny, hidden hinge. It was a small, circular compartment carved right into the core of the beam. Inside was a small, drawstring leather pouch. I pulled it out. It was heavy. I loosened the string and poured the contents into my palm. It was another key. This one was older, more ornate than the one for the front door. It was an iron skeleton key, and with it was a small, tightly folded piece of paper. I unfolded it. It was a note, not from my father, but in the strong, looping cursive of my grandfather. It read, "The past is never dead. It's not even past. Check the floor beneath your feet." It was a quote from a book I'd read in school. My grandfather, the harness maker, quoted William Faulkner. The layers of my family were becoming more complex with every discovery. The floor beneath the post. I got down on my hands and knees. The floorboards were wide, thick planks of oak. Right at the base of the post, one of the boards looked slightly different. The nails holding it down were newer, their heads less rusted than the others. I used a chisel again, wedging it into the crack and prying. The board came up with a screech of protesting nails. And there, in the shallow space of the subfloor, was a large, flat metal box. A safe box. The iron key slid into the lock perfectly. I turned it, and the lid opened with a heavy, satisfying thud. The contents of this box were different. There was no money. Instead, there were legal documents, birth certificates, passports, and another, thicker stack of letters, these ones tied with a black ribbon. And on top of it all was a single photograph. It was a picture of my father, looking no older than I was now. He was standing in front of the shop, his arm around another young man with a kind, worried smile. I had never seen this person before in my life. I picked up the top letter. It was from my dad, addressed to me. "Leo," it began, "if you found this, you have chosen to stay. Thank you. I knew you had his strength in you. The man in the photograph is named Daniel. He was my best friend, my brother in all but blood. And this shop, this legacy, is for him." The story that unfolded in those letters shattered the world I thought I lived in. Daniel, my father's best friend, had fallen in love with a man. This was back in the early 90s, in a small town that wasn't as accepting as the world is today. Their relationship was a secret, a dangerous one. Daniel's family was powerful, wealthy, and deeply conservative. When his father found out, he disowned him, threatened him, and promised to ruin his life. Daniel and his partner, a gentle man named Thomas, had nowhere to go. They were scared, and they came to my father for help. My father, remembering the promise he made to his own father, didn't hesitate. He used the harness shop, which was already sitting empty, as a sanctuary. He hid them there for a few weeks while he arranged for them to get to a city on the West Coast where they could start a new life, a life of safety and anonymity. He gave them all the money he had at the time. He kept their secret for his entire life. But the story didn't end there. Years later, Daniel, now a successful architect, had tried to pay my father back. He'd sent him money, offered to buy him a new house, anything. My father refused it all. He said the promise of the shop wasn't about money. It was about doing the right thing when no one was looking. But Daniel was persistent. He knew my father was too proud to accept a handout. So, they made a deal. Daniel set up an anonymous trust. He began buying up the debt of the properties surrounding the harness shop, the old hardware store, the closed-down bakery, the empty lot by the creek. Over the course of 2 decades, he secretly bought the entire block, all held by a shell corporation with my father as the silent, non-beneficial trustee. The documents in the safe box were the proof. The deeds, the corporate papers. My father didn't own a worthless harness shop. He was the secret custodian of an entire block of prime real estate in a town that, while quiet, was slowly starting to attract new interest from developers. Daniel died 2 years ago, from cancer, my father wrote. His last wish was that the trust be dissolved and that the properties be transferred to you on your 18th birthday. He never had children of his own. He said I had saved his life, and he wanted to make sure my son's life was secure. He wanted you to have a foundation to build on. A home. I sat there, on the floor, the documents spread around me, the sheer scale of the secret taking my breath away. My father hadn't just left me a shop. He and his friend had left me a future, a town square, a legacy not of leather, but of loyalty. The final letter was short. Brenda knows none of this. She only knows about the shop itself. I couldn't risk telling her. I was afraid she would try to contest it, to monetize it, to turn this promise into profit. A developer has been sniffing around Oakhaven for a while now. They will likely approach you. They will offer you a small amount for the shop, thinking it's a worthless property. The choice, Leo, is yours. You can sell it all, the entire block. You'd be a wealthy man. You could live anywhere, do anything. Or you can honor the promise. You can use this inheritance to rebuild, to create something for this town, to make this corner of the world a safe harbor once again. I can't tell you what to do. A man has to choose his own legacy. Just know that whatever you decide, I am proud of you. I have always been proud of you. I love you, Dad. The next morning, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize with a slick corporate area code. It was the developer my father had warned me about. A man with a smooth, confident voice named Mr. Thorne introduced himself. He said he represented a firm that was investing in Oakhaven. He said he'd heard I had inherited the old harness shop. He offered me $20,000 for it. Cash. It's a generous offer, kid, he said, his tone dripping with condescension. The place is a teardown. You'd be lucky to get half that from anyone else. We're just looking to clean up that corner of town. I thought about the $50,000 in the tin box. I thought about the deeds to the entire block locked away in the safe. I thought about my father and my grandfather and a man named Daniel whom I'd never met but who had changed my life forever. I held the phone to my ear, the dust of the workshop settling around me in the morning light, and I made my choice. Mr. Thorne, I said, my voice steady and clear, a voice I didn't recognize as my own. Thank you for your offer, but the property is not for sale. There was a moment of surprised silence on the other end of the line. Look, kid, he said, his voice losing its smooth edge. Let's not be stupid about this. It's a worthless building. No, I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. It's not. And I hung up. That phone call was a declaration of war, and I knew it. But for the first time in my life, I felt ready for a fight. I wasn't a scared kid anymore. I was Vance and Son. The first thing I did was deposit the $50,000 into a new bank account. It felt strange walking into the Oakhaven local bank, covered in dust, and handing over stacks of $100 bills. The teller, a woman with a kind face and a name tag that read, Martha, looked at me with open curiosity but didn't ask any questions. That was one of the things I was starting to learn about this town. People kept to themselves, but they watched everything. The money wasn't a windfall, it was a war chest. It was seed money for a new beginning. My first purchase was a new lock for the front door, followed by cleaning supplies, heavy-duty trash bags, and a pair of thick work gloves. The next few weeks were a blur of physical labor. I filled bag after bag with 30 years of trash, dust, and debris. I scrubbed the grime from the windows, letting the sunlight pour into the workshop for the first time in a generation. The light changed everything. It chased the ghosts from the corners and revealed the true character of the place. The wood of the workbench glowed with a deep, rich patina. The old tools, once I'd cleaned the rust off them, were beautiful objects, solid and honest. As I worked, the town watched. People would slow their cars as they drove by, their faces curious. The owner of the hardware store, a grizzled old man named Sal, started giving me discounts on supplies. "Good to see some life in the old place," he'd grumble, handing me a box of screws. "Your grandfather was a good man, stubborn as a mule, but a good man." Martha from the bank would wave as she passed on her lunch break. The waitress from the corner booth started bringing me a coffee in the mornings. "On the house," she'd say with a wink. "You look like you need it." I wasn't just cleaning a building. I was slowly, cautiously being woven into the fabric of the town. They didn't know my story, but they saw the work I was putting in, and in a town like Oakhaven, work was a language everyone understood. A week after my call with Mr. Thorne, a certified letter arrived. It was from a law firm representing him. It was a new offer, $50,000, and a warning. The letter hinted at eminent domain, city blight ordinances, and a dozen other legal threats designed to intimidate me. They saw me as a stubborn kid holding up their multi-million-dollar development project. They had no idea I was sitting on the deeds to the entire project. I took the letters and the documents from the safe box to the only lawyer in Oakhaven, a man named Arthur Pence, whose office was above the hardware store. He was old, wore a rumpled suit, and had an office that smelled of old books and pipe tobacco. He looked at me over the top of his spectacles as I laid everything out on his desk. Brenda's letter, my father's letters, the deeds, the developer's threats. He read everything in silence, his expression unreadable. For a long hour, the only sound was the rustle of paper. Finally, he took off his glasses and polished them with his handkerchief. He looked at me, a long, appraising look. "Your father," he said, his voice a low rumble, "was a very complicated man, and a very good one." He tapped the stack of deeds with his finger. This is a fortress. Thorne and his people think they're trying to buy a single brick. You, son, own the entire wall." He explained the legal standing to me. The trust was ironclad. The transfer of the properties to me was clean. Thorne's company had spent years planning a development based on a false assumption that the block was a patchwork of absentee owners they could pick off one by one. They had no idea one person held all the cards. "So what do we do?" I asked. Arthur leaned back in his chair, a slow, wry smile spreading across his face. "Well," he said, "we could sell. You'd walk away with a fortune. Or we could write them a letter of our own. We could show them what Vance & Son is really made of." The letter Arthur drafted was a masterpiece of polite, legal devastation. It didn't threaten or boast. It simply laid out the facts, attaching copies of the deeds to the surrounding properties and a formal declaration that the entire block, now consolidated under my name, was not for sale at any price. It also included a gentle suggestion that any further attempts at intimidation would be met with a harassment lawsuit. We sent it via courier. The response was immediate and absolute silence. Thorne's calls stopped. The letters ceased. It was like they had vanished. For the first time, I felt the true power of what my father and Daniel had given me. It wasn't just money or property. It was security. It was the power to say no. With the legal battle won before it even began, I turned my full attention to the future. I had an entire block of a town in my hands. The responsibility was terrifying and exhilarating. What was I going to do with it? My father's last letter had given me a clue. Make this corner of the world a safe harbor once again. I started with the shop. I didn't want to erase its history, but to honor it. I spent weeks carefully restoring the workbench, sanding it down and refinishing it until the grain of the heartwood shone. I cleaned and oiled every tool, hanging them back on their pegs. I found a leather supplier a few towns over and bought a few hides just to smell the scent of new leather in the air again. I wasn't a harness maker, but I started teaching myself, watching videos online, reading old books from my grandfather's collection. I started with small things, a key fob, a belt. The work was slow, methodical, and deeply satisfying. It was a conversation with my hands, a way of connecting to the two men who had come before me. But the promise wasn't just about leather. It was about refuge. The second floor of the shop was a dusty, forgotten apartment. 2 small rooms, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom. It had been my grandfather's first home. I spent the next 2 months gutting it and rebuilding it. Sal from the hardware store taught me how to frame a wall. Arthur, the lawyer, turned out to be a surprisingly good plumber. The whole town seemed to pitch in. People would drop off old furniture, a set of dishes, a spare lamp. They were rebuilding it with me. When it was finished, it was a clean, bright, safe space. I didn't move in myself. I still slept on a cot in the back of the workshop. Instead, I called a regional youth shelter and told them I had a free, furnished, short-term apartment available for any young person who had aged out of the foster system and needed a place to land. Just like my grandfather had done for those young men decades ago, I was offering a safe harbor. The first kid who moved in was a 17-year-old girl named Maya. She was quiet, wary, and carried all of her belongings in a single backpack, just like I had. I gave her the key and told her to stay as long as she needed. I saw the same look in her eyes that I remembered feeling in my own, a mixture of shock, suspicion, and a fragile flicker of hope. That was the real inheritance. That was the promise. The rest of the block took longer. The old bakery became a community arts center, funded by a grant I applied for with Arthur's help. The hardware store stayed, but I used the funds from the trust to help Sal renovate and expand. We turned the empty lot by the creek into a small park, a green space for the whole town. Each project was a brick in a new foundation, not just for Oakhaven, but for me. I wasn't just the boy who inherited the harness shop anymore. I was a part of the town. I had a purpose. One day, about a year after I first arrived, an older man I didn't recognize walked into the shop. He was well-dressed, with kind, sad eyes. He looked around at the restored interior, his gaze lingering on the old tools. "It looks just like I remember it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He introduced himself. It was Thomas, Daniel's partner. He had heard what I was doing in Oakhaven and had come to see it for himself. We talked for hours. He told me stories about my father, about his and Daniel's friendship, filling in the gaps the letters had left behind. He told me how my father's act of quiet courage had saved their lives, allowing them 30 years together that they never would have had otherwise. "Daniel would be so proud of you," he said, his eyes welling with tears. "You're honoring the promise. You're honoring them all." Before he left, he handed me a small, framed photograph. It was the same one I'd found in the box, of my young father with his arm around Daniel. But this one was a copy he'd had made for me. On the back, he had written, "Legacy is not what you leave for people. It's what you leave in people." I hung the photograph on the wall behind the workbench, right next to a picture of my father and me at that long-ago baseball game. The two images, the two versions of my dad, finally merged into one whole person. The quiet accountant and the secret protector. The distant father and the fiercely loving man. They were both him. The shop wasn't worthless. It was priceless. It hadn't saved me with money or property. It had saved me by giving me a history to belong to and a future to build. It gave me a home, not of walls and a roof, but of purpose and connection. It gave me back my father. My name is Leo Vance, and this is my inheritance. It's a story of second chances, of hidden sacrifices, and of the extraordinary value you can find in the places people have thrown away. And what my journey taught me, more than anything, is that the most valuable things we inherit are rarely the ones that come with a price tag. It's the stories, the values, the quiet acts of courage that echo through generations. It's the choice to build rather than to sell, to connect rather than to abandon. Your own story, your own inheritance, might not be a block of buildings or a box of letters. It might be a recipe from your grandmother, a piece of advice from a mentor, or the memory of a kindness someone showed you when you needed it most. That's the real stuff. That's the foundation you can build a life on. Thank you for listening, for being a part of this. If this story meant something to you, if it made you think about your own legacy, subscribe and join our community. Share your story in the comments below. Because every story of finding light in a dark place deserves to be heard. You are not alone in this. We're all just trying to find our way home.